We're going to leave the spinal cord itself now and talk about the spinal nerves. As you've seen in some of the drawings that we've looked at, the spinal nerves actually branch into two where they connect with the spinal cord. We're going to give these branches a name. We're going to call them spinal roots. So there is a dorsal root and there is a ventral root for each spinal nerve on each side of the spinal cord. The dorsal root is on the posterior surface and the ventral root is on the anterior surface. Now, I have dorsal and ventral shown in the red highlighted font here because these are the terms you should use. Dorsal root and ventral root. The dorsal root is actually carrying fibers coming in from the peripheral nervous system that have sensory information in them. Now, the other thing to know about the dorsal root of a spinal nerve is that it is associated with a ganglion right outside of the spinal cord. Remember what a ganglion is. In the peripheral nervous system, a nerve is a group of axons. A ganglion is a group of cell bodies. So this is a group of cell bodies that is in the peripheral, but is very close to the spinal cord itself. Now, there's also a ventral root for each spinal nerve, and the ventral root is carrying nerve fibers that are exiting. These are motor fibers. The dorsal root carries fibers that are entering the dorsal horn, sensory. The ventral root is carrying fibers that are exiting the ventral horn. These are motor fibers. The ventral horn itself is where the cell bodies of these motor neurons are. They're going to travel out into the periphery of the body to skeletal muscles, to smooth muscles, and to glands, and so on. Now, I do want to give a word of warning here. So far, we have talked about the spinal cord anatomy using the terms dorsal horn and ventral horn. And now we're talking about spinal nerves, and we're using the terms dorsal root and ventral root. Don't confuse horns, which are in the cord, and roots, which are parts of spinal nerves. So, if you look at the dorsal root of a spinal nerve, distal to the dorsal ganglion, the dorsal and the ventral roots are going to merge together. So I know, I just said a minute ago, that the dorsal root is what is actually sending nerve fibers into the cord, but if you go out of the cord distally from the dorsal ganglion, you're going to see ventral and dorsal roots merging together. And I'll show you a picture of this in just a minute. This is where spinal nerves leave that dura covering, that meningeal covering. This is where the dorsal and their ventral roots come together. The nerve exits the vertebral canal, remember the bony vertebral canal, through the intervertebral foramen. Now, dorsal root, ventral root, they're coming together, they're forming a single spinal nerve, they're exiting out of the bony vertebral canal through the intervertebral foramen. At this point, this spinal nerve and all spinal nerves are mixed. Remember, we said a mixed nerve contains both sensory and motor axons. The sensory axons are the ones that are heading towards the spinal cord in the dorsal root. The motors are the ones coming out of the spinal cord in the ventral root. So we have a mix once those two roots come together and make the spinal nerve. We have a mix. Remember, not only are spinal nerves mixed, but most of the nerves in the peripheral nervous system are mixed. So you've seen part of this diagram in a previous slide. You've seen this before when we were talking about the anterior median fissure and the posterior median sulcus. Now we're going to add in some of this terminology regarding these spinal nerves. Down here we see a very similar diagram. I brought this one in just because we can see a little bit more information here. So let's start up at the top. Orient yourself first. This is the spinal cord that has been transected. We're looking at the cut face. The person who has this spinal cord is facing over here. Their eyes are pointed in this direction. Their back is over here. Here's the dorsal horn of the gray matter here and here. Here's a ventral horn. Here's a ventral horn. Here's the commissure, central canal, anterior median fissure, posterior median sulcus, posterior funiculus, anterior funiculi, lateral funiculi. There are descending tracts in the anterior and the lateral funiculi. There are ascending tracts in all three funiculi. Now, out of the dorsal horn, we can see a dorsal root emerging. Very close to the spinal cord, we're going to hit the dorsal root ganglion, a group of nerve cell bodies. That dorsal root is going to continue on, where it's going to hit and merge with the ventral root. Together, those two roots are going to make up the spinal nerve, and it's going to continue outward through the intervertebral foramen. Same thing's happening on the opposite side. Now let's talk function. This dorsal root of this particular spinal nerve, and remember there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves coming in and out of that spinal cord. This dorsal root is carrying sensory information, so that information is traveling into the spinal cord. The ventral root is carrying motor information out. Once it becomes a single spinal nerve, now it's a mixed nerve. That functional information is more easily seen in this diagram down at the bottom. The dorsal root is carrying sensory information. It's coming in from the outside. So we're coming up towards the cord. We're hitting the ganglion here. We're coming into the cord here. Now we're into the central nervous system. This afferent information travels into the central nervous system and is integrated by both spinal cord and brain. The outgoing information is going to go out through the ventral root, and out towards the efferent cell, whatever that happens to be. These two roots are going to come together and make up a spinal nerve outside of the vertebral column. Now, there's one more bit of information that we need to know about these spinal nerves, and that's what happens to them after they emerge out of the bony vertebral column. We've taken those two roots and we've brought them together into one spinal nerve, and it comes out of the bony vertebral canal, and then it almost immediately starts to branch. And it's going to branch into 4. And from those 4 branches come all of the other nerves that we find in the peripheral nervous system. Now, the names of the 4 branches are the meningeal branch, the communicating branch, the anterior ramus, and the posterior ramus. This word ramus just means branch. So if it's easier mentally, just think of them as branches. Meningeal branch, communicating branch, anterior branch, posterior branch. But the anterior and posterior are still most commonly referred to as rami or ramuses. Now let's think about why this spinal nerve branches. It has to connect with all of the periphery. Remember, we've got sensory information coming in, we've got motor information going out. We need those spinal nerves, those 31 pair of spinal nerves, to get to the whole body. And that begins with this branching pattern. The meningeal branch is going to essentially turn around and go right back to the vertebral canal, because the meningeal branch of each spinal nerve is going to innervate the meningeal layers. Remember, dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater. It's also going to provide innervation for the vertebrae themselves, and it's going to provide information for the spinal ligaments. The communicating branch is going to head to the viscera. Remember, it's mixed. It's a mixed spinal nerve, so it'll have both sensory and motor fibers within it. The posterior ramus we'll do next. The posterior ramus is going to innervate muscles and joints in the midline area of the back, hence the name posterior. It's also going to innervate the skin, but again, in the area of the midline of the back. That combines with the anterior ramus, the last one we'll talk about. This is the one we'll talk about in a little bit of detail. The anterior ramus is going to innervate the lateral muscles of the back, the lateral skin of the back, and it's also going to give rise to what we call nerve plexuses. And I'll talk about these in a little bit of detail next. It's the nerve plexuses that are going to send nerves out into the limbs. So the anterior ramus, that branch that comes off of each spinal nerve, is what eventually innervates our limbs. On this diagram, we can see how a spinal nerve branches after it comes together, leaving the spinal cord. Let's orient ourselves. Here's the cut surface of the spinal cord. Gray matter in the center, white matter around it, myelinated axons, dorsal horns, ventral horns, central canal in the commissure, anterior median fissure, posterior median sulcus. Here's the dorsal root with the dorsal ganglion. Here's the ventral root. The edge, if you will, of the vertebra that's in this area is going to end right here. And this combined spinal nerve is going to exit through the intervertebral foramen. Now, this spinal nerve is going to essentially immediately branch. Here's the first one, that's the meningeal branch. That one's going to turn around and go back in because it's going to provide innervation for structures of the vertebral column and the spinal cord. This communicating branch is going to eventually provide innervation for the viscera. The dorsal ramus is going to eventually provide innervation for the midline muscle and the midline joints and the midline skin up and down the back. And this anterior ramus is going to innervate the lateral muscles and the lateral skin of the back and the limbs. Now, before it can innervate the limbs, it forms into what we're going to call plexuses, nerve plexuses, and there are 5 of them. So this anterior ramus, and remember, there are 2. There's one on the left side and there's one on the right side. They're actually going to vary a little bit from one region to another, up and down the spinal cord. In the thoracic region of the spinal cord, the anterior rami are going to go on to become intercostal nerves. Remember, intercostal nerves travel along the surface of each of the ribs. In all of the other regions up and down the spinal cord, the anterior rami are going to become what we call nerve plexuses. Now, what the heck is a plexus? It's just a fancy term for a clustering of nerves. So from the anterior ramus is going to sort of spray out a tremendous branching array of nerves. Now, there are 5 of these plexuses in total, and when you look at them in a living body, at surgery, for example, it's amazing how they spray out, how they start as this individual anterior ramus and then immediately spread out into many, many individual branches. It's almost web-like. These plexuses include a cervical plexus, and I'll show you an image of where they lie in just a moment, a brachial plexus, a lumbar plexus, a sacral plexus, and a coccygeal plexus. Now, an important point here, there is no thoracic plexus. It doesn't exist. There is a brachial plexus. This is a plexus that occurs right around the area of the armpits, if you will, in a human being. But there is no thoracic plexus. Remember, the anterior rami in the thoracic area of the cord are going to become intercostal nerves. It's in the other regions that the rami will become these plexuses. Remember, spinal nerves are mixed nerves, so they have both sensory and motor functions within them. When it comes to the plexuses, the sensory information includes a very particular type of sensation information that we call proprioception. Proprioception refers to information about where the body is in space. Now, I know that's a strange thing to wrap your head around, but if you close your eyes right now, even the parts of your body that are not touching anything, you are still aware of where they are in space. So even with your eyes closed, even when you are not touching something to give you sensory information, you have an idea of where your arms are, where your hands are, where your legs are, where your back is. You have a fundamental sense of where your body is in space. That's what we call proprioception. And proprioception signaling is particularly located in these plexuses. It's coming in these plexuses where the brain is picking up body position information. Now, of course, there's also motor impulses, that are at the nerve plexuses. And this is just general motor information coming. On this diagram, you can see the location of each of these 5 plexuses. So we've cut the body in half. You can just see the neck of the person here. Here's a shoulder and the beginnings of the arm. This would be the area around the rib cage. Here's the waist and the hip and one of the legs. So you can see the vertebral column here. You can see spinal nerves coming off. Remember, these spinal nerves branch very quickly into those branches that we discussed: meningeal, communicating, posterior, anterior. Now, when it comes to that anterior ramus, it too is going to branch. In the thoracic region, it's going to create the intercostal nerves. But in the other regions, it's going to create these clusters that we call plexuses, these web-like clusters. The nerves in the plexus areas are tangled together, folks. They are literally clustered up and tangled together. Here is the cervical plexus. Here is the brachial plexus. Remember, there is no thoracic. Here is the lumbar plexus. And here is the sacral. Now, think about what's happening here. Anterior rami are made from each spinal nerve in this region, and the branching that occurs distal to that anterior rami, each one of them, is creating this cluster of nerves. In the lumbar area, multiple spinal nerves are involved here. The lumbar spinal nerves are involved here. They are branching, and one of the branches is the anterior ramus. Each one of those anterior rami themselves are going to branch out and create this clustered, tangled web called the lumbar plexus. As we finish up today, I want to talk about one more key thing to understand about spinal nerves as it relates to sensation, and that's the concept of the dermatome. Each of the spinal nerves, with the exception of C1, cervical spinal nerve 1, does not have this, but all of the rest of the spinal nerves, C2 to C8, all of the thoracic spinal nerves, the lumbar, the sacral, the coccygeal, all of these spinal nerves receive sensory input from all over the body, including the skin. Now, the region of the skin that provides sensation information to each individual spinal nerve is called a dermatome. A dermatome. And we have dermatomes for the human body mapped, very, very well mapped, by the way. If you think about it, it's not difficult to do this. You can prick the skin and you can determine where that sensory information is hitting the cord, which spinal nerve it's traveling in order to get to the central nervous system. So we have created dermatome maps. This is what a dermatome map might look like. And these are hanging up on the walls of any neurologist's office that you might go into. What you're seeing here, all of these sections that are drawn out with black lines, these are dermatomes. So each individual area between 2 black lines is a dermatome. The colors that you see relate to whether you're talking about cervical dermatomes or thoracic dermatomes or lumbar dermatomes and so on. But see how interesting the patterning is. Sometimes these dermatomes travel horizontally, sometimes they travel almost vertically, sometimes they're sort of diagonal between the two. Different dermatomes wrap around the left and right sides of the body differently. They're really quite fascinating. Now, why would we bother with this? Why would we map dermatomes? Well, dermatome maps are very helpful because it helps us localize spinal cord injuries or spinal cord diseases. By knowing where we've experienced a loss of sensation in the skin, we know where there has been some kind of an injury to a spinal nerve. Similarly, there are disease conditions that will increase sensation in various dermatomes, and so we will know again through skin pricking which spinal nerve is involved. So very, very helpful in tracking damage to spinal nerves and the spinal cord. Now, a couple of important things to know. While we have carefully mapped out each and every dermatome and where their limits are, where their edges are, adjacent dermatomes, so side-by-side dermatomes, can overlap by as much as 50% in different people. In other words, if I had 3 dermatomes, 1, 2, and 3, side by side, dermatome 2 in the middle is going to overlap dermatome 1, and it's going to overlap dermatome 3, at least a little bit, sometimes as much as 50%. So, why do we care about that? Well, let's say you wanted to block sensation. Let's say you wanted to do a nerve block procedure on someone, so you could then do some sort of surgical procedure and they wouldn't feel it. They would not be aware of the pain associated with the procedure. You can do that by anesthetizing or blocking spinal nerves, and this is done all the time in medicine. But if you want to block sensation in a dermatome, you can't just anesthetize one spinal nerve. You can't anesthetize just the nerve that feeds that dermatome. You also have to anesthetize the 2 nerves on either side because of this overlapping phenomenon. Just a little piece of information for you regarding the practical uses of dermatomes. This is the map we looked at a moment ago. There are actually lots of these maps published, lots of them available. Here's another. The dermatomes, the areas of the skin which provide sensation to each individual spinal nerve.